Tonight on Primetime Politics, a controversial go-ahead.
It has been Russia that has escalated the conflict.
The U.S. gives Ukraine permission to use American missiles against Russia. How will this move change the course of the war? Will it provoke Russia to widen its offensive to include NATO countries? We will speak with retired General Rick Hillier. Also,
we're prioritizing permanent residents with the skills we need.
Cutting immigration to get housing stocks back up. We'll speak to the Parliamentary Budget Officer and get his assessment of the Liberal plan. Plus, APEC in Peru, G20 in Brazil, both occupied with Donald Trump's return to Washington. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. We'll get to those stories in a moment, but first, we do want to note a development in the parliamentary standoff that's now into its 8th week. You'll remember that late in September, House business came to a standstill after Conservatives raised a motion of privilege. It asked the Trudeau Liberals to hand over documents on a green technology fund. Conservatives wanted the records so that the RCMP could review them for any criminal wrongdoing. The government did hand over some documents, but reportedly many were redacted, and the government expressed concerns that the unredacted versions would violate charter rights. But then this happened today.
I wanted to update Canadians to let them know that the government has provided nearly 29,000 pages of documents with regards to the SDTC matter to the House of Commons. We have just done so in a way that complies with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that protects the rights of Canadians, and we have done so in a way that protects police independence and the separation of powers in our country.
At the time of this taping, Conservatives have not commented on the release of these documents. We are following the story, though, to see if it helps end the standoff in the House. Well, to the matter of Ukraine now, as the United States is giving Kyiv permission to use American missiles on Russian targets. Called an Army Tactical Missile System, or ATACMS, the go-ahead signals a major change in U.S. policy, as Washington until now has been worried about triggering a wider war. But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky welcomes the move, describing the development as a path to victory.
The plan to strengthen Ukraine is the victory plan I had presented to partners. Long-range possibilities for our army is one of its major points. Today, there is a lot of talk in the media about us receiving a permit for respective actions. Hits are not made with words. Such things don't need announcements. Missiles will speak for themselves, for sure.
Well, for more on this development, we're now joined by retired General Rick Hillier. He was Canada's Chief of Defence Staff from 2005 to 2008, and among his many current roles, now chairs the Ukrainian Strategic Advisory Council and also does some work with Quest Defence, which is a defence contractor. General, thank you for taking the time.
Michael, my pleasure.
Now, Ukrainian officials have reportedly been lobbying for this permission for well over a year now. How might this change the course of the war for Ukraine?
Well, I think it's going to give Ukraine a tool, a weapon, quite literally, that it has not had. It is long needed, and it's been desperately trying to get it. I mean, they've had the ATACMS with the capability of going longer for almost 2 years now, and they've had the longer range missiles for a year at least, but they haven't been able to use them. And so as a result, Russia's kind of had free reign on all those air bases and storage depots and command and control centers and missile launching sites within 300 kilometers of the Ukrainian-Russian border. And as a consequence, Ukraine has been attacked and hit night after night after night after night. People have died, and Ukraine has been on a back foot. I think that's just about to change now, because the ability to hit deep and surprise the Russians is going to have a major effect, whether it takes out missile launching sites, whether it takes out command and control centers, or whether it takes out, really hard to get fuel depots, or whether it takes out senior commanders. This is going to make a difference. It's not going to win the war or lose the war, but it will make a difference.
Now, it has been suggested that the missiles, these ATACMS, could be used to secure Kursk in western Russia in order essentially to give Ukraine some leverage if they're forced into peace talks with the new administration. What do you make of that strategy?
Well, that's not a strategy that is going to put Ukraine in a winning position. Yeah, it's a tactical move, if you will, that will give them a better seat if there should be discussions about how this war could be ended in the very short term. But I think what it will do is give Ukraine an opportunity to really make an impact on Russia's ability to continue to wage the attacks upon Ukraine and Ukrainians right across the country. And whether that's troops moving forward, they can take out crucial bridges, you can take out oil and gas nodes, you can take out those command and control nodes, and in fact, you can take out concentrations of troops in areas by using specific ammunition. So I think it goes beyond more than Kursk and what it can do there, although it would be helpful. I think this is a much greater tool than just for a tactical fight on the battlefield itself.
Now, President Putin, of course, of Russia, has warned that using American missiles on Russian soil would mean NATO is at war with Russia. Are you concerned that by using these missiles, giving this permission, that it will necessarily widen this conflict?
I'm concerned about a madman in Moscow doing anything, which he has been for the last 2.5 years or so. And he's been allowed to get away with it because we have taken counsel of our fears in the West. And every time Putin said, oh, I'm going to do this, we ran away and said, oh, no, well, we won't do anything more. I think we let him get away with it. President Macron of France said 6-8 months ago, hey, it's time. We took the strategic initiative. And I actually think that this is what is happening right now. The Americans are sending Putin a very tough message here. Hey, the Ukrainians will have the tools to do the job. We're not going to handicap them. We're not going to restrict them. And you're not going to be able to win this war. And so Putin will do what he wants. But here's what I would say in closing that part of it. Putin is a survivor. He travels with a massive team of doctors. He lives on vitamins. He keeps people away from his close proximity because of disease and threats of being killed. He wants to survive, and he knows that if he escalates this very much, he will not survive. And that's one of the things that he will want to do. So, yeah, do you worry about what he'll do? Absolutely. Do I fear it every day? No, I do not, because he realizes the consequence of escalating beyond where he is right now. We should worry about him being successful in Ukraine as opposed to him escalating the fight, because he started and escalated from the beginning.
So you don't think he would hit other NATO targets or use this as an excuse to hit NATO targets?
No, I do not believe he's stupid enough to do that. I do not believe that the people around him would think that that's a very smart move. And, this guy has got no out. He's got nowhere to go, and he's got to keep the people around him on side. And if they see that their futures are going to be ended because Russia is going to attack NATO, I think the threats to Putin and his position and his very life would increase dramatically. Also, NATO is pretty much prepared for this right now. The air defenses have been upgraded. The troops have been upgraded. They've been training, preparing for it. And if we get caught unawares now, then it should be upon us. That won't happen, I'm confident. And I don't think, therefore, he will try to strike NATO targets directly. There may be some stuff around the edges. There may be something like pipelines that he'll try and take out. But then again, we're prepared for those things also. And NATO, I think, can handle itself capability. Its own capability is sufficient to handle itself against Russia.
What's interesting, perhaps troubling, is the fact that this permission is being granted by Joe Biden. Joe Biden, of course, has little more than a month left in office before the transition happens over to Donald Trump. And I think there's a bigger question mark about what Donald Trump's Ukraine policy will actually be. How much insecurity does that cause, giving this permission, but at the same time knowing that the permission may be rescinded within a matter of weeks?
Well, first of all, Joe Biden is still the president. He is till, 20 January? And so within his command authority to do this, I understand. And clearly he has done it. What the Ukrainians can do in 3 months is pretty incredible. And they can put Russia's strategy on its back foot without question. What happens after 20 January? I don't know. I can only guess at certain things. But I would suggest that between now and the 20th of January, there's a great opportunity here for the United States, supported by NATO. I mean, NATO countries have already come out and said this is the right move, and they're in support of the Americans. And I think that in the next 3 months, there are a lot of things that could be done to put Russia on its back foot, put Ukraine in a much better position, and have a whole new sort of opportunity on 20 January, no matter what President Trump decides to do. I think President Biden made the right decision here.
General Rick Hillier, always appreciate the insight. Thank you for that.
Michael, my pleasure.
The Prime Minister took to YouTube on Sunday, releasing a 7-minute video to explain the government's recent decision to reduce immigration targets for the next few years. Now, the Trudeau Liberals had originally promised to bring in 500,000 people in both 2025 and 2026, but the government is now cutting those numbers to give housing supply a chance to catch up.
In the last 2 years, our population has grown really fast, like baby boom fast. And increasingly, bad actors like fake colleges and big chain corporations have been exploiting our immigration system for their own interests. So we're doing something major. We're reducing the numbers of immigrants that will come to Canada for the next 3 years.
Now, you heard the Prime Minister say it, bad actors throwing the initial immigration targets off by trying to game the system, which the Conservative leader pushed back on today.
The Prime Minister is again a pyromaniac masquerading as a firefighter, this time on immigration. He blames bad actors for his decisions on that destroyed our immigration system. If the Prime Minister is hunting for the quote-unquote bad actors who ruined the system, will he have a look in the mirror?
I don't think we'll take any lessons from someone who spent the last 20 years lighting fires in the House of Commons. That's it. We put forward a plan 2 weeks ago to reduce immigration levels by 20%. Canadians expect us to be responsible and to react to their needs.
The Immigration Minister, Mark Miller. Well, the politics aside, let's actually talk about the numbers, because as you heard just last week, the Parliamentary Budget Officer published a report. It looked at how reducing immigration targets will address the housing gap. And to talk about it, we're now joined by the PBO, Yves Giroux. Yves, thank you for joining us again.
My pleasure.
So let's talk about this, because you found that the immigration changes will close the housing gap. So how quickly, how soon will people be able to perceive that?
Well, it should happen relatively quickly. When you're talking about housing and demographics, quickly is a span of a couple of months. According to the government's own plan, we should see a reduction in the number of non-permanent residents in the country by about 900,000 non-permanent residents over the next 2 years. So that's 2025 and 2026, by adjusting the inflows and not renewing the visas or permits, work permits, of about 2.8 million non-permanent residents. So there will be an impact starting to be felt in the coming months.
Yeah, as you take hundreds of thousands of people out looking for that housing demand. But you know, you also note the fact that despite what the government is saying, their estimates, in terms of reducing the numbers, it won't actually close the gap as much as the Trudeau Liberals say it will. Why is that? How did you come up with that conclusion?
So we looked at the number of house or units being built over the next several years. We had to revise that upwards as a result of the National Housing Plan and the various programs that are making their way into the construction market. We also looked at suppressed demand over the last several years as a result of increasing prices, and we arrive at an estimate of the number of units that should be built compared to the number of units that will be built, assuming that the current pace continues. And we had initially estimated that at about 1.2 million units in terms of gap that needed to be addressed to restore the availability needed to meet demographic demand. And with the reduction in the number of non-permanent immigrants as well as the permanents that the government has announced as well, we estimate that the gap is now 658,000 units as opposed to 1.2 that we had estimated earlier this year. And that's due to the lower demand from non-permanent immigrants.
Mm-hmm. But still, so a reduction in the demand, but still not where the government would like to see it.
Exactly. There's still a gap of hundreds of thousands of units, over 600,000 units, to restore the supply to where it should be, considering the demographic factors.
Now, how much of that is tied to this big risk that you talk about in terms of the demographic projection? Talk to us about what you see as the big risk and whether or not that's tied to the fact that you're coming up with a different number than what the Trudeau Liberals are saying.
Yes, we identify in the report that we released last week, we identify a risk in that even though the government has plans to reduce the number of non-permanent residents in the country, there are risks that it will not materialize as planned. For example, employers have been very vocal over the last several years in expressing the need for temporary workers. Post-secondary institutions have also been quite vocal that they need international students. So if the government proceeds as planned and reduces the number of foreign workers and foreign students, it's very likely that this will create tensions with employers and post-secondary institutions. Another element of risk is that while we can let these visas expire, there are no exit controls in Canada, so it's very difficult for the government to be certain that those whose visas have expired have indeed left the country. So these are risks that we talk about in the release or in the note that we released last week.
So when you look at the government numbers, then, is that the best hope for case? And what you're saying is perhaps it's not going to reach that because of all these other factors?
Well, the bank has expressed some skepticism as to the Bank of Canada as to whether this will indeed materialize in one of their monetary policy reports. We've also expressed some reservations as to whether it will indeed happen. And I'm talking about the plans, the government's plan to reduce temporary foreign workers or temporary non-permanent residents to 5% of the population from the 7%, upwards of 7%. So we have expressed doubts that this will be achievable in the short term.
So I guess in shorthand then, it will have an impact. How much of an impact we're going to have to see. Now, before we're done here though, because there was also another number that was quoted here, and the very fact that the government estimates that their cuts will lead to a slight population decline of 0.2% over the next 2 years. Is that any cause for concern? You know, we've been hearing for decades now, we have an aging population. We need to get immigration up in order to fund our social programs. If we're looking at a decline, no matter how small, is that something to be concerned about?
Not in the short term, because it's temporary and it comes on the heels of significant demographic growth, a couple of years of very rapid growth. So to have a year or two of modest decline like that is not something that is concerning in a demographic context. It could have temporary economic consequences. Fewer people means fewer producers, fewer consumers, so it could negatively impact economic growth for the years where we are expected to see a decrease.
Okay, again, we continue to watch. Yves Giroux, always nice to have you here. Thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Well, time now for a look at what else happened in politics today. An assassination attempt targeting former Attorney General Irwin Cotler came to light today. First reported by the Globe and Mail and then confirmed by Cotler himself, the now human rights advocate was reportedly targeted by Iran for speaking out against that country's ruling regime and for lobbying Ottawa to classify Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist entity. In late October, the RCMP warned Cotler that his life was under imminent threat. That threat has now been reportedly lowered, but the RCMP is not saying whether any arrests have been made. Negotiations between the Canadian Union of Postal Workers and Canada Post resumed Monday, but for the first time with a special mediator appointed by Ottawa taking part. Labour Minister Steve McKinnon says he wants to see a deal done at the bargaining table rather than forcing a solution. The strike, which began on Friday, is halting mail and parcel service across the country as the busy holiday season begins. And finally, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is in Brazil today to start a meeting of the G20 in Rio de Janeiro. This after wrapping up the annual APEC summit over the weekend in Peru. But with both gatherings, discussions were dominated by a leader who wasn't there, Donald Trump. Trump will not take office again until January, but ahead of his inauguration, world leaders are already discussing what his return might mean for trade and international relations. During his previous administration, Trump withdrew the United States from several international agreements and at times had difficult relationships with allies. Well, for more on the gatherings taking place in South America, we're now joined by Senator Peter Beohm. He chairs the Senate's Foreign Affairs and International Trade Committee, also a former diplomat himself. Senator, thank you for taking the time.
Good to be with you, Michael.
So here we have these meetings taking place in South America. Donald Trump not yet inaugurated, so not there, but already dominating discussions, arguably because he's not much of a free trader himself. He's more concerned about trade partnerships that benefit the United States. I'm wondering how that starting point affects the countries who are gathered here. What type of concern does that create for APEC and G20?
Well, first of all, we have 2 months to wait until Mr. Trump is president again, and I can understand that there's a lot of speculation and concern about his policies. These summits are about more than just trade. In fact, trade tends to be a very small part of it, but I think because he spoke so forcefully on trade and on a minimum 10% tariff on all imports into the United States, this is obviously an issue of some concern. I would add to that concerns regarding the U.S. again pulling out of the Paris Agreement on climate change, which it did at the end of 2017, and then Biden and his administration went back in. So that's obviously another concern when you have a summit that is dedicated to some green solutions for the climate change crisis in the world.
Mm-hmm. So, as you say, raising concerns. And, you know, it was also remarkable over the weekend because we heard Xi Jinping of the PRC make a global appeal for free trade, calling on members of APEC to, quote, tear down the walls impeding the flow of trade. How remarkable is that? Maybe even strange to hear it from a leader out of Beijing instead of the administration going into Washington.
Well, China has a lot to lose if there is a lot of tariffication going on, to use a word, but so do other countries. So to me, it's quite clear that in the many bilateral meetings that are taking place behind the scenes in Rio and earlier at the APEC meeting in Peru, leaders are comparing notes as to what they think and how this might go. I would add as well that Mr. Trump has been around the block before. He has attended summits. They're not his favorite vehicle for discussion. He likes to have the one-on-one meetings where he can practice his art of the deal at the highest diplomatic levels. So it's going to be interesting to see how these summits evolve. And of course, Canada will be chairing the G7 next year. So that's a big factor as well in terms of thinking that our own policymakers will have to undertake.
Mm-hmm. Well, picking up on what you said there, the fact that Trump likes to do things more one-on-one, he also seems to be, in addition to that preference, he also seems to be very much focusing on more isolationist policies. So what is the better strategy here for Canada? To continue being an internationalist, if you will, or perhaps working more closely with the United States for continental advantage?
Well, Canada has always been an internationalist or a multilateralist, and part of our multilateral vocation, I would argue, is to have an offset to the overwhelming bilateral relationship we have with the United States. So, as before in his first term, so I suspect in the future, we will be working with the United States on many different policies. We might not always agree on everything, and there may be exceptions that the U.S. would want to take, as well as us. And I recall back in 2018, in our final communique out of the Charlevoix summit, there were a number of paragraphs where the U.S. simply disassociated itself from what the other leaders wanted, and that's how the final communique went out. And too bad, so sad, there wasn't complete unity there. But the U.S. and Mr. Trump were firm on things that they wanted to include, or other things that they did not want to agree to. So I suspect we'll have more of that. There's also a certain legacy in terms of carry-on initiatives from one summit to another. The Americans, including Mr. Trump during his presidency, did play along with that and wanted to work together to move things forward. And I suspect we'll see some of that again as it becomes clear whether campaign rhetoric and campaign promises is really going to be the path that President Trump and his administration will take.
Mm-hmm. And certainly that is something people are watching out for, to see whether the promises actually materialize into policy. Now, we did hear Melanie Joly, Canada's foreign minister, say over the weekend that many countries were turning to Canada at APEC to ask about Donald Trump, to essentially get advice on how to navigate a second term. What expertise can Canada offer at that level?
Well, look, we are, I would argue, the United States' best friend, and it's vice versa. We work together in so many international bodies and in financial institutions and at the UN. There's some common DNA there that goes right back to the start in 1945 of the new international order, as it then was, and its institutions. So it is a tradition that other countries have come to us and asked, well, what do you think the Americans mean by this? And we will give a view. And then there's our own relationship, which I would characterize as interdomestic. It is both international and domestic because of all of the ties that we have across the border, and of course the tremendous trade and investment relationship that we enjoy. So. Others, of course, want to hear from us. In the case of Mr. Trudeau, he's one of the longer-serving leaders at these summits. He's experienced, and they will be soliciting his views.
Well, we are certainly watching the summit, and as we watch it, Senator, thank you so much. We appreciate the insight this evening.
Thank you very much, Michael.
And that is our program for this Monday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow. Until then, take care.